and this is sure to be a dynamic matchup. Let's quickly take a look at the teams that they'll be featuring in this set.
So we did get to see Yoav play yesterday. Well, we casted his match yesterday with that Sun, Venusaur, Charizard, Groudon, Porygon 2, Incineroar, and Grimmsnarl. And then Francesco Piopero, also with Sun, instead opting though for that Regieleki and that Umbreon. And it's definitely going to be a very bright match today.
Yeah, we talked a lot about Sun throughout the course of the last 2 days, and no surprise to see a bunch of Sun teams here. Francesco Piopero actually went undefeated, I believe, in the European regional qualifiers with this exact team, so no surprise to see it make it back here to the global finals. Now, while both of these players have Sun, there are some key differences. Of course, on one side, you've got the Regieleki. On the other side, you've got that Grimmsnarl and the Porygon 2. So one thing that's really interesting about the Sun kind of mirror matchup is who do you actually end up maxing? It kind of feels like a rock, paper, scissors matchup where Venusaur does really well into Groudon. Most Groudons actually aren't running fire type attacks, so they don't do super well into Venusaur, but they have that Rock Slide, which turns into Max Rockfall. That helps against Charizard, and then Charizard beats the Venusaur. So it's like, you know, if you choose to max something and your opponent maxes one turn later, they could potentially counter whatever you max with one of those 3 options. So one thing that I'm really looking at for in this match is basically who maxes first, and does your opponent bring the right counter. I also think Regieleki and Umbreon can play a big role, as well as the Grimmsnarl on the other side. So while, you know, there are a lot of similar Pokemon on both teams, I think it's all about setting up for your Maxmon and trying to sweep with it in this set.
Also excited to see progressing into a game 2 and 3. Like you said, it's a big rock, paper, scissors. Who's going to do which, who's maxing first. It'll be really interesting after the first game plays out how they'll adjust going into game 2, because I feel like it's just mind games all over again at that point. They played a certain way this game, so what do I do to counter? And I don't know, it's going to be really exciting. So that being said, let's get on into this match here.
And I think one thing that I definitely have a question mark is how are these Pokemon trained? You know, do they have the same speed stats? Most Charizards and Venusaurs typically will actually end up speed tying in a mirror match like this. Now, there are some slight differences, and we see those differences come out right away with that Regieleki and that Grimmsnarl.
Yeah, and then of course as well, these Charizards facing down against each other on each side of the field here. Really excited about these starts here, especially there's a form of like speed control on each side here. You have that Regieleki with that Electro Web, and on the opposing side, you actually have that Grimmsnarl with the Thunder Wave as well, which is be interesting to see what these players opt to go for leading this first turn.
Yeah, and I really like the Regieleki lead here just because it's an open team sheet tournament. Francesco most likely knows Yoav's Grimmsnarl can't really stop the Regieleki on turn 1. Speed control is so important in a matchup where both players are using similar Pokemon. So Yoav doesn't want to take any risks and plays a little bit more defensively, switching into that Incineroar to start the game.
Charizard opting for Protect just to scout out a little bit. Grimmsnarl opting to set up a light screen instead. The Regieleki is just going to go for that Electro Web there, gaining a little bit of speed control and dropping those Pokemon right down here.
Yeah, and I think, good switch by Yoav there. You really don't want to risk your Charizard, especially in front of a Regieleki. Regieleki only gets electric type attacks here, but those are really, really good into Charizard. So Yoav probably doesn't mind the speed drops very much. The Grimmsnarl is actually really essential in getting up those screens, but because I think Yoav's basically going to try to play towards this end game where your Pokemon are just bulkier than Francesco's Pokemon because you have the screens, whereas Francesco doesn't. And now, as you've seen, Yoav has brought in a lot of support Pokemon in that Incineroar and that Grimmsnarl, whereas Francesco has opted for a lot more offensive options, right? Leaving something like that Umbreon back. And so for Francesco, I think it's all about setup. When do you Dynamax, and can you basically swing the momentum into your favor and gain a monumentous lead? Because Yoav's going to definitely play a little bit of a slower game in this match, trying to bait out the Dynamax first.
I like the variety that Francesco's brought with the different attackers and stuff too. Can really scout out what Yoav is bringing, what he's doing going into this first match, and can counter appropriately. Regieleki is just going to hit an attack into that Grimmsnarl as the Grimmsnarl fires back with that Spirit Break, bringing that Regieleki way down with that critical hit here. I mean, Regieleki's not the bulkiest Pokemon out there either, but that critical hit, the double critical hit, the huge from Incineroar as well, is going to knock this Regieleki right out of here.
Yeah, you certainly don't see double crits happen too often, and like you mentioned, Regieleki isn't exactly super defensive, so I'm wondering if that double up, even without the crits, would have actually picked up the KO. Might have been a little bit close, but U-turn, a really strong option there. I think you know, if Yoav just stayed in with Incineroar there, went for something like a fake out instead, then Francesco's in a really phenomenal position where you bring out Groudon. We know that this Groudon has Swords Dance as well, as we've seen throughout the course of the tournament, and then that's going to be a perfect opportunity to capitalize with the Swords Dance. So Yoav, you know, manages to switch into a position where now the Groudon is threatened. I think one thing that's really important about the dynamic of this mirror match is if either players can get a Swords Dance off with Groudon and then max it, it turns into such an offensive monster, especially because you can actually max Quake for those special defense boosts. And if you get a single special defense boost, that can be really valuable against an opposing Charizard or Venusaur. So Francesco, you know, nice positioning to get that Groudon out. Yoav one step ahead, gets that Charizard to pressure it. Groudon, however, still in a pretty good spot right now. You know, can consider maxing here. Max Rockfall can just eliminate Charizard immediately. Yoav, on the other hand, now has to make the decision. Do you actually end up maxing your Charizard just to go for something like a G-Max Wildfire, or do you want to conserve your max for the last Pokemon?
Right, so it looks like Yoav is also going to Dynamax. We saw from the selection screen that Francesco was as well, but Yoav firing back with his own Dynamax here is going to be that Charizard, of course, which, if it's not for the Mixer, it's going to take a big hit from this opposing ground here. But, I mean, moves like G-Max Wildfire, getting them set up is just so valuable, and all the residual damage that will be done turn after turn here.
That's a super good point. Yeah, you know, we've seen Colossal dominate the last two Players' Cup, and typically, you know, you want to have all 3 turns of your max, but sometimes it's worth it just for that 1 turn of max to get that residual damage off, because it sets you up so well for the end game. Now, Charizard on Francesco's end won't actually take residual damage, but it's still important. And I think the other thing here is if you don't go for a G-Max Wildfire into Groudon, you know, Francesco could Swords Dance, and that'd be really, really tough for Yoav. So I think Yoav feeling the pressure to go for the max here, to go for this G-Max Wildfire, just to get a lot of damage onto it. Sure, Max Rockfall will pick up the KO onto Charizard, but that trade-off, I think, might be actually worth it for Yoav, because otherwise, if you leave Groudon unchecked, and Francesco, you know, made the aggressive play of Swords Dancing, you're in a really, really tough spot afterwards.
Big hit onto the ground, bringing it about half health as Francesco fires back with this rock ball. Charizard not standing up too well to that and is going to be KO'd, as well as setting the sand here going forward.
This is definitely going to be a close finish here. I mean, Yoav has that Grimmsnarl, has that Incineroar. Neither of those do that much damage in the context of this matchup. Charizard's going to launch a Heat Wave here for some good damage on a Grimmsnarl, but not enough to actually pick up the knockout now that Sun is no longer around. And Yoav presumably should have Groudon as his last Pokemon. So the question is, can his Groudon close this one out? Yoav does have, you know, the screens up from Grimmsnarl. That's really valuable. You also have that Incineroar to be able to switch in for that Intimidate. One thing that can also be a really big deal here is if the Venusaur on Francesco's end, you know, I think we've seen that it doesn't have Protect, which means that you could potentially, if you time things right, bring in Incineroar to go for a fake out onto it, and then Groudon can maybe just chip it off. So here, you've got the Sun up. I think from Yoav's end, Groudon probably wants to just go for a Rock Slide. You really don't want to faint or take too much damage from Charizard's Fire type attack, so just eliminate Charizard before it can do anything, because a Charizard in Sun right now will really hurt the Groudon. Grimmsnarl also getting that Thunder Wave for speed control to slow things down a little bit. And the question now is, can Francesco actually beat the Groudon? Earlier I said that Incineroar doesn't have, you know, that much offensive pressure in this set, but it does do well into Venusaur specifically, and that could be really important for Yoav in this end game.
Of course, especially with the Sun set, that Incineroar can just hit a big hit into the Venusaur to take it out very easily if it comes down to those 2 Pokemon. Charizard just opting to go for the Protect here, not wanting to get off. And the Grimmsnarl just going ahead and taking up the opportunity to set up screens here. The Groudon is going to hit a big Max Quake into the opposing ground. Not actually that big after screens, only actually doing about a third of health, and really showing how valuable Grimmsnarl can be, reducing the damage done.
Is it Rock Slide, or is it something like Swords Dance? Oh, it's actually gonna be that Swords Dance. That's such a fantastic call on Yoav's end, because it punishes the Charizard Protect so heavily. And like you mentioned, Sierra, the Groudon doesn't even take that much damage from Max Quake just with that Reflect Up alone. And so that's such a phenomenal Swords Dance now, because you can just go for Rock Slide knowing that the Charizard protected now. Groudon's not even able to do that much damage into the opposing Groudon. Yoav can still, you know, switch out Grimmsnarl into Incineroar. Maybe you conserve it just because you want Grimmsnarl to faint here, get that free switch into Incineroar. I think a switch here could be fine though, because you already have that Reflect Up. You're gonna get it Intimidate into Groudon, and so unless Francesco crits with the Max Quake, I think then you're gonna be in really really good shape, even with that Incineroar switch in, even if they target it. So that's such a good sword stance there. Francesco trying to bait out the Rock Slide and just get damage onto Yoav's Groudon. Yoav says, hey, I don't really need to worry about the Charizard as much because I'll have Light Screen and Reflect Up, and if you protect on Charizard, puts the Groudon in a game-winning position. So fantastic call by Yoav there, and he is going to make that switch into Incineroar to get that Intimidate off.
Of course, Incineroar hitting the field again. And, I mean, Incineroar is not going to take too much damage from this Charizard anyway, and Groudon we saw targeted into Yoav's Groudon anyways with this Max Quake. And see how much it's doing this time around. Barely tickling it, not doing any damage. This Groudon is sitting pretty with his attack boost and just not taking any damage here. And even just bringing it down to the point where it can recover its HP up using its Citrus Berry, basically bringing it back to where it was.
Ooh, Groudon dodges the Rock Slide, but that's not the right one, and Charizard ends up getting hit by it, and this is exactly what I was saying earlier. Right now, you've actually managed to get Incineroar out on a turn where Francesco is forced to bring out that Venusaur, and without Protect on that Venusaur, you can actually just go for a safe Fake Out onto it and a Precipice Blades on the Groudon. So Yoav timing this really, really perfectly. The Citrus Berry on Groudon also shows why he was confident to make that Sword Stance play, right? He had already set up the Light Screen in the beginning of the game. You just get Reflect Up that turn, and with those two, you can actually probably survive a combination of the Max Quake and the Heat Wave from the Charizard anyway. And so I think Yoav feeling pretty confident that turn to set up the Sword Stance works out even better for him because in the end that Charizard ended up going for a Protect. So this late game Groudon, after getting that Sword Stance boost, after getting the screens up, just in such a phenomenal position at this point from Francesco's end. I think you're really hoping for a couple of misses with Precipice Blades. Looks like Francesco's opting for that Rock Slide, so right play here to try to go for a flinch this turn so Venusaur can target Groudon next turn.
Of course, we see that Fake Out hitting into the Venusaur here. Groudon is going to connect the Rock Slide on both of the Pokemon and not doing too much damage here at all, and is unable to pick up the flinch either as Groudon fires back with Precipice Blades and taking them out of here.
Yeah, definitely a little bit scary of an endgame there, right? Yoav obviously set himself up into this really phenomenal position, but great awareness by Francesco to realize, hey, I still have a chance to win this game, right? Precipice Blades' his accuracy, not exactly that amazing. If you actually get that Rock Slide flinch onto onto the Groudon, then the Venusaur can target it down next turn, and you can definitely try to pull off a comeback still. But in the end, the Groudon on the opposing end does not flinch, hits both of the Precipice Blades, and ends up sealing the first game.
Man, just goes to show, too, I mean, Francesco really got to utilize all three turns of the Dynamax, but unfortunately didn't actually really make a dent after taking out the Charizard. Yoav only used the one turn of Max before the Charizard went down, but was then able to just sit back behind the screens, just set up, and just be able to overpower the game there, which was a really fun endgame to watch here.
Yeah, and it really feels like that Grimmsnarl's the difference maker in this set, right? Sure, it doesn't really do any damage, but Thunder Wave is valuable speed control for Charizard and a potential Venusaur, and more importantly, you just have so many turns of Light Screen and Reflect to work with, and in the end, the Groudon just, it's so little damage, and it effectively feels like the Charizard in its one turn of Max did the same amount of damage as Groudon in its 3 turns of Max, and so Groudon, can be a strong Max option, but you really want to get that Sword Stance off, and what was important was that Yoav never let that Sword Stance go off for free, basically trying to punish it every turn if it were to set up a Sword Stance, and yeah, great job to basically not let it get a free boost up, because if it does, then it really can take over the game.
Of course. That being said, let's get into the game 2 here to see how Francesco responds to this Grimmsnarl and what adjustments are made here. So Venusaur and Grimmsnarl coming out on Yoav's end here as well. Francesco opting to lead again with that Regieleki and that Charizard.
So the Venusaur, a little bit of a mix-up here. Definitely pressured by that Charizard. We were talking about that rock, paper, scissors matchup in the beginning before going into this set. One of the questions I had was, does Francesco actually maybe want to consider bringing the Umbreon into this set? Because, it can disrupt Yoav's team a fair amount and stall out the screens a little bit. But opting for the Regieleki plus Charizard combination once again. And one thing that's interesting, once again, with this matchup is, do you really want to commit a Dynamax immediately on turn 1? From Francesco's end, doesn't really want to go for that immediately. And, ooh, we're going to see the switch out into Groudon. And I feel like this means the Sleep Powder might be coming onto one of these two Pokemon.
It's always so dangerous with the Venusaur on the field. You never know if it's going to be a Max or if it's going to be a Sleep Powder, which it is a Sleep Powder into that Charizard, putting that Charizard right to sleep here. And the Venusaur voids the Electro Web coming out from this Regieleki as well. So Francesco not faring positive after this first turn here.
No, I mean, a miss there would have been absolutely huge for Francesco, and that's the scary thing about going for Sleep Powder on turn 1. If you miss, you often put yourself in such a big hole, but Yoav manages to connect with that, gets the Groudon in a pretty good position now. And so now what's interesting with Groudon is, do you go for something like a Rock Slide? Do you even consider Swords Dancing here? Swords Dance would be really greedy, but could have huge benefits should Charizard take another turn of sleep. Francesco, has the potential to wake up immediately right now. This Venusaur can now direct its attention over to Regieleki, go for something like, an Earth Power into it if you're carrying it, or you can switch Venusaur out if you're afraid of Regieleki protecting this turn.
All right. We are going to see the Earth Power coming out from the Venusaur and just taking the Regieleki right off the field here. Regieleki going down means no more speed control on Francesco's end. Charizard taking another turn of sleep here. And this round is just going to take the opportunity to hit a Rock Slide, just going full offensive and picking up the double KO for Yoav this turn here.
Yeah, and so this is why, a lot of players going into this tournament had hard counters to Venusaur. We've seen stuff like a Lumberry Charizard, for example, but Francesco's Charizard here not being Lumberied. That's a quick 4-2 lead for Yoav. So, positioning himself well. Sleep Powder can always be a really volatile move, but ends up getting the best possible outcome where Charizard takes 2 turns of sleep, doesn't wake up, and Yoav has such a monumentous lead right now. It's definitely not over, though. I think Groudon and Venusaur can definitely pull off a comeback from Francesco's end, especially when you have something like Swords Dance and Sleep Powder. There is definitely an opportunity to still, pull off a comeback right now. But for Yoav, I mean, those first 2 turns basically played out as perfectly as possible. You have the same 2 Pokemon as your opponent right now, but you still have that Grimmsnarl on the back instead of screens, and a 4th option in the back for Yoav as well. So Francesco looking at that Weather Ball, it looks like, to potentially try to just do as much damage into Venusaur that might actually just pick up the KO if Venusaur does not go for the Gigantamax this turn. I like the Protect on Groudon as well, because if Groudon doesn't protect, Venusaur maxes and goes for that Vine Lash, Groudon will probably just faint.
Yoav opting to just swap out, bringing the Incineroar in to bring the attack down on this Groudon here, and just hoping to slow down any momentum that Francesco could try and gain this turn. We are going to see Yoav as well opting to go for that Dynamax. Venusaur finally coming out to play here after really putting in work these first few turns here. Man, just Venusaur is so scary in max form and out of max form, and it's going to be looking to pick up some big damage here.
Big damage for sure, and even something like a Vine Lash puts that Groudon on a timer, right? Sure, it doesn't do that much damage through the Protect, but then Groudon just takes so much residual damage each turn. There is that Weather Ball, and it does a sizable amount. Francesco's Venusaur did go first there, so I'm not sure if it's going to be a speed tie between these 2 Venusaurs, but if it's not a speed tie, and you just outspeed, you can just KO the next turn with something like a Weather Ball. You can even max the Venusaur now, but, Francesco making the correct play there to protect and go for that Weather Ball. I think one other option is maybe you just go for Sleep Powders and target everything around the Venusaur, but definitely feeling the pressure from a potential Gigantamax Venusaur. That being said, Yoav does get the Incineroar out right now, right? So that pressures with Fake Out. Francesco actually smartly didn't go for a max last turn, so now you have to kind of play the mind game, like who do you think is going to max? But the main thing I'm watching out for here is the interaction between the Venusaurs, because if Francesco's Venusaur goes second, Yoav can just knock out the Groudon, and that blows any comeback potential away. If Francesco is actually able to knock out the Venusaur first, and you get this Swords Dance off with Groudon, Venusaur and Groudon from Francesco can definitely pull off the comeback. So I think this is a really, really critical turn. Who does Venusaur on Yoav's end target, and which Venusaur moves first in this position?
We're about to find out here, as Francesco, of course, going for that max. I mean, if it's a speed tie here, this is going to be really, really dicey, but I mean, you have to play it to what you can here, and it's all going to be coming down to this Venusaur, and let's see who moves first here.
Oh, it's Yoav's Venusaur! Oh, was a speed tie there in the end. So, Francesco's Groudon just goes down, and I think any chance of coming back now is eliminated because a Swords Dance off with Groudon and eliminate a Venusaur from the way. So, I mean, sure, you get the knockout onto the opposing Venusaur now. This Incineroar also opted not to go for something like a Fake Out, so perhaps another U-turn or just a Flare Blitz and just so much damage. So, this is the scary thing when you use, similar Pokemon that are very meta. You do run into the risk of potential speed ties. It's gonna be a Flare Blitz coming out. That does so much damage. And the burn added insult injury.
The burn to boot. I mean, it was over, but picking up that burn as well, of course, just rubbing a little bit of salt in the wound there. That's always so difficult with the speed ties. Of course, this is open team sheet, but that's only showing the moves and the items. It doesn't show the stats, so Francesco had to play it, seeing that he was faster the turn previously, and just try and go for it. But unfortunately, losing the speed tie the second time around is going to cost him the game, as he just opts to close it out there. But it was still well played.